Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're kicking off a new series, the Law School Toolbox Book Club. This is a chance for us to chat with you about the books we're reading and why you might want to check them out. And today we're talking about Becoming. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta, I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're kicking off our new series, the Law School Toolbox Book Club. This is a chance for us to chat with you about what books we're reading and why you might want to check them out. The first book in our series is going to be Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. I'm sure that most of you listening have heard of Obama's book, even if it is just seeing photos of her from her book tour. Do you remember those incredible thigh-high boots that she wore?
I do remember those. They were great.
Everywhere. And she met with almost every star. The gold, yeah, I know. Yeah. So her wardrobe choices were memorable, along with a lot of things that she said in those on that book tour. But we both read the book. But I'll be honest, I listened to the book because I don't have time to read anymore. I just listen to books when I walk the baby around. And we both found it really interesting and thought-provoking at times. For those of you who don't know much about the book because you're busy law students, Becoming is an autobiography of Michelle Obama's life up to this point. It starts with her childhood in Chicago and follows her through Princeton, Harvard Law. Well, kind of. She doesn't actually talk much about law school. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Life as a young lawyer in Chicago in a big firm, her life with Barack, and her journey to the White House and beyond. So it's quite an interesting read, especially if you're into autobiographies, which I am. I'm kind of a nerd. I love my good nonfiction. So to just kind of start it, Alison, I thought maybe we'd talk about what were our favorite parts of the book, or what do we find interesting about her story and what she chose to share?
Yeah, I think there's so much that's interesting about it. I mean, for me, I think I actually liked best the earliest materials about her childhood and kind of growing up on the south side of Chicago and what that was like at this time of transition. And it was just really interesting to see kind of, what a difference. I guess I related to the part about going to the Magnet High School because I also went to a Magnet High School boarding school, and that was fundamentally life-changing. And to see that one thing kind of making such a big difference for people, I thought was really very inspirational.
Do you know one of my best friends teaches at that high school now?
Wow.
Yes, at Whitney Young. And yeah, it's very funny. I'm like, wow, your school is so famous. I had no idea.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I mean, I think, just that idea of you can grow up in a city and then there's this whole other world going on around you and you don't necessarily have exposure to that. I also thought it was very interesting when she was later talking about working for the University of Chicago as their community outreach. And she said, for her, Princeton was somehow more accessible than Chicago.
I thought that was fascinating too. And how kind of blinded the University of Chicago had been to this whole part of their community. Yeah, and this talent pool. And I think that's one of the things that her mom had said, and I can't remember if this was part of the book or part of one of the articles I read about the book, but somebody asked her mom, was she so surprised that her children had been so successful coming out of the south side of Chicago? And she made a comment, there are tons of kids.
Yeah, I think it was in the book.
Just like mine.
Yeah, it's no, I'm not surprised.
Right.
You have the wrong impression of what this is like.
Yeah. And, and I think that is really fascinating how we so often overlook these entire populations. I think the legal profession specifically overlooks these talent pools, but I did think that was interesting when she was talking about the University of Chicago as well. And it was a bizarre distance of how close it was.
No, it's literally basically in the south side of Chicago. They have a wall, but it's right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's probably a lot more that we could say about that. But
yeah. What did you like about it?
What did I like about it? Well, I really found her childhood stories interesting. I really thought her discussion of the entire community of the people that were part of her growing up. So her, I think it was the family member who they both lived in this building together, the aunt, and she did the piano lessons, and I thought that was really interesting. But I thought it was such a good discussion of how it does take a village to, raise a child, and how different people can have such a big impact on someone who's growing up. It's not, her parents had a huge impact on her life, but these other important individuals did as well. I really liked her discussions on motherhood. I've talked to other moms. I even have a mom friend who knows the Obamas, and she was saying how she really appreciated the dialogue about motherhood, not only her struggles to become a mom, but I thought she was very honest about how she shouldered the majority of the family responsibilities and balancing her duties and wants for her children and her family with this spouse who is incredibly ambitious.
Right.
And a workaholic, clearly, which I guess was good for the country.
Right.
But it could be tough to be married to. I loved her honesty around her struggles with the legal profession, how she was kind of a perfectionist and was a box checker, and didn't really take a lot of time to soul search about what she wanted to do with her life other than be very successful. I thought that was a familiar story.
I think a lot of lawyers could probably relate to that. Like, oh, you're at an Ivy League school and you're doing well and you don't really have a full plan for your life. So why not go to law school?
Right.
What's the downside?
What's the downside? And then you get this big fancy job. I also thought that she had some really frank discussions and thoughtful discussions about race and what it felt like to be one of the few Black students at Princeton, one of the few young Black lawyers in law firm life. I was shocked by the story of how the mother of one of her roommates at Princeton didn't want...
Yeah, that was...
her daughter,
much.
Yeah, rooming with a young Black woman. And I think it was totally my white privilege talking, shocked that was happening in the 1980s. I'm sure that many people who weren't living in my white privilege may not have been as shocked as I was, but I found the story very shocking that it had happened at that point in our history, just to show how kind of deep-seated some of that racism was still going on, especially at these elite universities. Coupled with that, she also was very frank about what it felt like to be the only woman in a room, both at these elite universities and then practicing law. And I think many of us have had that experience of being one of a few women in the room. And I think she made a really interesting point about kind of learning about, that men weren't necessarily smarter. They were just... I think the quote was emboldened, floating on an ancient tide of superiority, and buoyed by the fact that history had never told them anything different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that there's a lot going on there.
There's a lot going on there, but I thought that was really, a very lovely way to phrase a reality that many women, I think, forget, is that, men have been raised with this culture that has told them that they should speak up and they should be giving their opinions, and their opinions are worthwhile. And I think we're getting better at telling young women that, but I think we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I was having this discussion recently with someone about whether he had white male privilege or not.
Oh.
Yeah, you can imagine how well that went. But, but part of the point was like, you're a mathematician. You have not had the experience of walking into a room and someone thinking to themselves like, yeah, he's probably bad at math. Just because of what he looks like. I'm like, that's not an experience that you've ever had.
Yeah.
That's privilege.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had a lot of favorite parts, but I'm almost done describing my favorite parts of the book. I thought that she had interesting observations about the pressure that was going to be put on her as the first Black First Lady, that she was going to be scrutinized at a different level. I thought that the discussions about how she'd been scrutinized by her words and comments during the campaign were really interesting observations about, how sound bites work. And I was just thinking of, luckily, I'm not in a position to want to be part of politics or married to somebody who wants to be part of politics. But what happens when your words become sound bites, and the amount of training and kind of almost studying that you have to do to become this role that they asked her to play. And she didn't like politics.
Right. I actually thought one of the most interesting pieces for me as kind of a takeaway was when she was getting a lot of negative feedback about, you're this angry Black woman on the campaign and all these things. And of course, that was totally unfair in a lot of ways.
Right.
And, completely loaded with like racism and sexism and all these things. But to her credit, she actually went and watched video footage of herself without the sound on. And she kind of looked at it objectively and said, well, I can kind of see where some of this is coming from, and that's something that I need to work on, which I thought was so self-aware. And, brave, really.
Right. And then didn't she go demand that they give her a staff to help her?
Exactly. She demanded a staff and coaching and all these things. Like, if you're going to put me out there in this position where I'm going to be criticized, you need to give me the tools, which I thought was such a great way of kind of approaching this thing that, like, of course, is upsetting and not fair. And just saying, look, this is what it is. I see where these possible issues are coming from, some of them, and, like, I need media training.
Right.
Like, if you're going to put me out there as a media person.
Right. That's quite the growth mindset.
Yeah, really. I mean,
really
to an extreme.
To an extreme. But, she did step up and ask for what she wanted. And I think it was also interesting how this woman, who is incredibly brilliant, I mean, she's incredibly brilliant, was still really kind of taken aback by some of these roles she was being asked to play, and that she had to learn how to play these roles. And I think it was also an interesting lesson of academic brilliance, or she's clearly a very hard worker. She was good at what she did. She got a lot of accolades for a lot of what she did. And then she was put in this different arena, and then she had to get good at that too. And admitting that she needed help is incredible vulnerability.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I thought the other thing that was interesting was her honesty about the feelings that she always seemed to have about whether she was good enough. I thought that was a theme that was really woven throughout the book.
Right. Well, that's straight up perfectionism 101. We can all go back to our Brene Brown on this one.
I know. Which is currently the book that I'm listening to, one of Brene Brown's books. Maybe that's the next podcast. Next. But yeah, so I think maybe that's why that really spoke to me, because I have been hearing a lot about perfectionism and vulnerability and shame. And I know that perfectionism is something that lawyers as a population deal with. So it was interesting how that kind of followed her through the White House, and, being under such a microscope about what she wore and how she spoke and what she did with her family was really interesting as well. So there were just a lot of really, really interesting nuggets in the book.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
And it was also kind of crazy to listen to some of these crazy experiences about living in the White House. I mean, how bizarre.
So she was reading it herself. Did she do the audiobook?
She did the audiobook.
Oh, that'd be nice.
Yeah. So you kind of felt like you were getting to hang out with Michelle Obama.
Because for me, the final part in the White House was somehow like a little bit more, I don't want to say distant, but I was kind of like not quite. It was kind of like, oh, this is fun and like kind of gossipy, but I felt like it wasn't quite as engaging as the earlier pieces. But maybe if she'd been like telling the stories, I would have liked it.
I think it was a little more interesting because she was telling the stories, but I also felt like she had clearly thought so much about her journey to get to the White House. I felt like the way that she laid out that story, it was just a beautiful tapestry, a beautiful journey. And then the White House was kind of like a bunch of stuff that happened.
Right.
It was just, and maybe she hasn't had time to digest it. They haven't been gone for that long.
Yeah, no, it's true. I'm reading We Were 8 Years in Power, which is super interesting. It's just a series of 8 essays written basically, political stuff. And so I think I just finished year 8, and that was when suddenly like everything changed. Yeah. And so part of the book is that he's going back and reflecting on like the meaning of these essays now, or how he interprets them, or what he's thinking about. And so it's fascinating to have somebody reflecting on something they wrote in like the first year of the Obama administration about like presidency and race or whatever.
Yeah.
From this perspective, like knowing how this turned out.
Yeah.
I still have the epilogue to go. So I don't know, maybe there's something like to sum it all up in there. But
yeah, there's an interesting documentary called The Final Year, which was they did all the footage during the final year of the Obama administration from a foreign policy perspective, where they kind of follow around all the key foreign policy folks as they try and set up their legacy, basically, I think is the best way you can say it. And the election happens during that. And not only how it kind of shifts what they were trying to do, they kind of went into this final year with this plan of like, how do we want to leave the world? And then it was more like, what do we do now that everything has changed?
Now that we're in like triage.
Right, exactly. So if you want to nerd out on political stuff, there's no shortage these days.
But I think everyone kind of who's writing about these sort of things is not had enough time to reflect. So like we're kind of in this moment, and it's really chaotic, and we don't really know what's going to happen even in a couple of years from now. And so everyone's just sort of like, wow, this is not really fully reflected upon yet.
Yeah, and I think if you are troubled by what's happening in the world, in the political world, it was very interesting to go back and kind of relive some of these Obama era memories.
That was so great.
I know.
I remember when they were in Grant Park and Oprah was crying.
Right. I've also been listening to Ben Rhodes' book, which is his reflection on the Obama years, which is also quite interesting. But it allows you to pretend that the world was different for a while.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's where, like, you know, the 8 years in power is an interesting one.
Yeah.
And, yeah, all those. I mean, yeah, everybody's kind of trying to figure it out, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, what does this mean? Where are we going? What was this really about? I don't know.
So one of the things, though, that made this book very relevant for us to talk about on the podcast, beyond just the fact that we thought it was a good book, and she's a lawyer, is she was very frank about her feelings about attending law school and becoming a firm lawyer and then kind of becoming disillusioned.
Yeah, and like there wasn't a lot of detail, like, for example, of her time at Harvard.
No, she just kind of skipped it.
She was like, oh, and then I went to law school.
I know.
I was like, I want to hear more about that, Michelle. Like, tell us more about that experience.
I know. I thought that maybe, because I was listening to it on the audiobook, I was like, did I skip ahead? Did I miss the chapter on law school?
Yeah.
It was like, I went to Harvard and then I left.
Right, then I got a firm job.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, what was that like for you?
Yeah. So I feel like that she definitely, let's say, maybe that wasn't the most pivotal time for her, because it's clear that law school didn't speak to her from just the little bit that she wrote about it. And it doesn't seem like the practice of law spoke to her as well. She really seems to have described that taking the LSAT was just what she did because she was still climbing this achievement ladder.
Right, the ladder.
The ladder. And it was like the LSAT was the next thing on the ladder, and then Harvard was the next thing on that ladder, and then the job at Sidley and Austin was the next thing on the ladder, and then she was kind of scratching her head saying, there's no more ladder.
Right.
Now what do I do?
Yeah, although I think there is a lot of pressure, but also desire on a lot of, for people who go to law school from a background that's not so privileged. Like that's part of the reason I went to law school is I was like, well, if I graduate from a top law school, like I'll always be able to get a job and take care of myself. Okay, that has value. Right.
And I think she describes it that, she had her office on the 47th floor. She had an assistant, a wine subscription service, Armani suits, and because you can, she bought a Saab.
Right, exactly. Which would be basically the golden handcuffs.
Which is the golden handcuffs, yeah. And she talks about the golden handcuffs in her decisions to shift out of law firm life, because I think the next job she went to was at City Hall with Valerie Jarrett, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact details, but definitely that was pretty soon.
It was pretty soon. And she took like a 50% pay cut. She talks about that.
She was with Barack at that point. He was basically making no money. So.
Right. So she all of a sudden went, and, from this, big firm job to all of a sudden, cutting that in half and then having, a public interest lawyer spouse.
Right.
Who I also thought it was funny that every time they had money trouble, he just thought he'd write another book.
Well, it worked out okay.
It did work okay out of him. Go to Bali to write a book. Also, that part was pretty funny.
Yeah, I have to say there were certain things I was like, wow, she was very tolerant.
Yeah, very tolerant. I don't know that they just got back from their honeymoon and he went to Bali.
Yeah, to write a book. And left her alone in Chicago in the winter to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, she sacrificed.
She did. I guess that's just being aware of who you've married, but I don't know if I would have been as understanding.
No, I did think it was interesting that she seemed very aware of the differences in their sort of viewpoints and mindsets and personalities. And, Barack Obama, whatever you think of him, is a very, very unique individual with a very unique background. So I think for somebody who grew up in that kind of close family, everyone, your neighbors, you live there your whole life. And it must have been very, interesting, but also challenging to have this person come into your life who's just sort of oh, hi, I'm really flighty. I've lived all over the world. I'm brilliant, but I have all these ideas and I don't really care about money. And
right. And I can just fix problems that come up. And I have this deep call to public service and community organizing. And, and then he was so drawn to politics and she wasn't.
Yeah, and it is funny. After reading the book, you're like, could people please stop asking if she's going to run for office? She's not going to run for office.
No, she clearly does not want to run for office. She hates politics. Yeah, I also thought the fact that she talked about not only their journey to couples therapy, which I thought was incredibly honest, and also her journey to not accommodating him to build the life that she wanted, especially with her girls, but coming up with some sort of solution that worked for both of them. I think it was about when he would get home from dinner. Like, she was all stressed out about making sure when he was serving in the Illinois Senate, I think it was, that, she wait for dinner for him to come home.
She was just like, actually, we're just going to eat without you.
Actually, we're going to eat at 7 or whatever time. And if you're home, great, but that's when dinner time is. And this idea that she wasn't going to let her life be reactive to his, even though, they were somewhat at a whim of his schedule. And I thought, that lesson probably served her well as he became more and more powerful and his time became more and more in demand, because, she couldn't have just survived by trying to match what he was doing, because he was always seemed to be on another plane.
Right. Well, also I thought the power of her female friendships were really interesting, and how much people relied upon each other just for day-to-day stuff, but also for moral support. And that was great how she kept all those people in her life, took them all to Camp David.
It's true. It's true. There was just an article that I shared with, I have a group of girlfriends, and we take an annual girls trip every year that I went to college with. And there was a study out that girls trips are good for your mental health. I'm sure that, and I'm like, well, yeah, now we just feel more justified. We should just go longer, maybe twice a year. So the other thing that I thought, especially law students would find interesting, is how hard it was for her to decide what to do next when she realized that Sidney and Austin was not going to be the solution that she had hoped, or the long-term solution.
Right, which I think people forget. There's so much focus in law school about getting that firm job, and now you're all set for life. And reality is something like 80% of people leave in the first 5 years. So almost everyone who starts working in a firm is going to have to address this question sooner or later of well, what's next?
Mm-hmm. And I thought, she really was lost for quite a while, and she tried journaling to try and find out what she wanted to do. It was clear that she really called on mentors and friends. But I thought that the idea that it wasn't clear and was kind of a meandering career path after that, because she kind of bounced around and did quite a few different things when she left firm life. She worked for the city, and then she worked for the University of Chicago. She was the executive director of a nonprofit, and then she was in hospital administration. She definitely kind of bounced around using maybe a similar pool of skills, but her role was not a linear path. And then you could tell it was hard for her when she decided that she could no longer keep that job as the hospital administrator because of the demands of the campaign.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think if I haven't figured it out immediately, I'm never going to figure it out. But you never know. You could end up being in the White House.
You never know. And then writing books and wearing amazing boots and outfits and hanging out with famous people.
Yeah, apparently they translated this book into something like 30 plus languages immediately upon release. Because my book club in Mexico was reading it, and I had to make sure it was in Spanish. I was like, not only is it in Spanish, it's in a lot of other languages.
That's crazy. That's pretty amazing. That shows her international appeal and the Obama's international appeal.
Yeah, and good for her. Writing her own book.
Yeah, and also the universal nature of her story, her kind of coming of age story, that it can resonate with people who have a lot of different journeys. And I follow her on Instagram, and she had a funny Instagram post because she was just on the Grammys.
About her mother.
About her mother. Did you see this?
The text messages, yes.
Yeah, that her mother had a funny text message. She had asked her mom if she had seen her on the Grammys, and she asked her if she'd met any real famous people.
Yeah, did you see any real stars? I was like, I'm a real star now, Mom. Thanks.
It's I'm pretty cool. Yeah. People fill auditoriums and I think even, arenas to see her at this point.
Oh, for sure. The tickets sell out instantly. Everybody I know wants to go.
Exactly. So I think one other piece that I definitely took to heart when I was listening to this, thinking about our listener pool, was that she failed the bar.
She did fail the bar.
She did. She went to Harvard. She failed the bar.
Yep.
I know. So if you're listening, it's okay. Even Michelle Obama can fail the bar.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good takeaway because I forgot what she said, but she basically didn't study, as I recall.
No, she didn't take it seriously.
Yeah, she kind of did some other stuff. I think there was a wedding of some friend involved or something, or her brother. I mean, it happens.
Yeah. And it's a story that we hear even from very accomplished people. There are plenty of accomplished people who have failed the bar. But I thought it was an interesting lesson that, even she had been such a studious person
right.
for her, entire academic career. And then kind of this last ultimate test, she kind of blew off and then she was shocked.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting the way she told it in the book, too, because as I remember, she didn't bring it up immediately. It was kind of like she did her whole, I went to law school and I was a lawyer. And then, later in the book, she's like, oh, by the way, I failed the bar.
Right.
So I was like, I wonder if there's still some lingering, stuff around that.
Well, I mean, how could there not be? I figure that, she hasn't failed a ton in her life.
True.
I mean, I'm sure she's had stumbling blocks.
Also failed the bar.
She
maybe
did.
That's how you get to be first lady.
Be an accomplished woman lawyer and then fail the bar.
And then blow off the bar because you have better things to
do. Well, I think that if you're looking for a study break or something to do on holiday, that this book is worth your time because it's interesting and she's just an interesting person.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great story. I think she tells the story really well. I think it's very relevant to law students and lawyers and people who are kind of still trying to figure it out. You don't have to have everything figured out at 22.
Right.
Your life is not over. You can decide not to take the LSAT for a year. And just being thoughtful, really, about, what she wanted and, how that was going to fit into this sort of crazy life she'd signed up for.
Yeah, and how what she wanted and her priorities changed.
Right.
I mean, she was a, ferociously protective mom of her girls, especially in the public eye. And I thought, she was very honest about her concerns about her family's safety. And she had nightmares about things.
That was intense.
Yeah, things happening to her kids and to her family. And, I think as we as women take on all of these different roles as lawyers, as significant others, as maybe mothers, that, we're pulled in lots of directions. And I thought her shifting priorities were very telling, but also she was able to be in multiple roles at once. And I think that was also an important lesson to take away.
Well, and I think, too, thinking of some of these things literally as a role can be helpful for people. So, if somebody... sometimes people, I think, get the idea there are just certain types of people who should be lawyers or people just know how to do this. And that's not really true. Even someone like Michelle Obama had to basically learn how to be in front of a crowd giving a talk. It's the same thing as being in court. If you want to be a litigator and this is not necessarily something that you feel comfortable with, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Right.
It means figure out the tools and the people that can help you. And then create that persona, basically, of me as the courtroom litigator, whatever that looks like. And it doesn't have to look like, it's kind of always looked.
Yeah. And if you're struggling with your career choices or even in a relationship, that you can, use different tools to kind of find your path. She used different tools to decide what she wanted to do next in her life. It sounds like she did a lot of informational interviews.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, sign me up. There's lots and lots of informational. And the thing is, those paid off a lot of them later.
Yeah.
She would get the call being like, hey, we talked and now I have this thing that you might be interested in.
Right.
Do you want to talk about it?
Exactly. And then when she hit a rocky time in her relationship and she didn't feel like she had the skills to fix that, they went to counseling and they got advice on how to be better partners. And, I think she definitely seems to have an openness for continuing to learn and push herself. That is probably why she's been able to be in all of these roles.
Yeah, exactly. I also love the story about her mother who just would sneak out of the White House.
Oh, that was amazing.
No Social Security, no Secret Service protection.
She'd go grocery shopping.
Yeah, it's crazy. You're like, wow, you can just do that? They don't follow you?
And it was funny. I don't think I know what her mom looks like.
I mean,
I don't know if I've ever seen a picture of her.
I've seen a picture of her maybe on stage, 2 or 3 times when maybe. Yeah, I wouldn't recognize her on the street. Certainly not. Which was her point.
Right.
She's like, I don't want to be recognized. I want to have a normal life.
Yeah.
I thought it was great when Michelle started going to her Soul Cycle stuff in class or in DC. You just turn around and you're like, oh, that's Michelle Obama. And everyone's got to be cool.
I know. Yeah, I guess I've never lived. You've lived in DC?
No, I did a lot of work in DC.
Oh, okay.
I was always flying there for depositions and stuff.
Yeah, it's just a different world.
It's crazy.
People run into people doing exercise classes. And
oh yeah, I was sitting in dinner one time and the caravan went by of like, you know, seemed to be the president's real motorcade, but a friend of mine who lives in DC was like, oh no, that's not the real one, because there's like one difference with the real one. He's like, that's the fake one. They just run around sometimes to like confuse people.
Yeah.
And apparently they have like 3 and they just drive them around, so you never quite know who the real one is.
Yeah.
It was weird. I was like, it's the president. And they're like, no, it's not. But then I think like another time it actually was. Like, it was weird.
Well, I guess if you want to have run-ins with the political who's, then you just go live in D.C.
Did one of our tutors send us, her kid recently ran into some new politician?
Maybe.
Alexandria, whatever her name is, Ocasio-Cortez.
Oh, really?
I think check Slack. I think one of our tutors sent, their kid was in D.C. and she thought it was like a rock star sighting. And the kid was like,
AOC? Yeah. That's really funny.
She's right there.
I mean, there are some people that I would have some rock star. I mean, if I saw Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I would be very.
I mean, I've met her. She's really nice.
I know
she's very small.
I know. I have not met her. But I was pretty excited when I met Sandra Day O'Connor back in the day.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're total dorks.
Yeah, we are.
I know, I'm like very bad with celebrities in general. People would be sitting next to me in New York and like, oh my God, like, do you know who that is? I'm like, no. Apparently, John Malkovich literally ran into me once at Sundance and I didn't know who he was. And that was right after being John Malkovich had come out and everyone had seen it except me. And they're like, you don't know who that is? I'm like, I have no idea who that is. Like, that's John Malkovich. He just ran into you.
Well, I interned for Michael Douglas in college.
I mean, I might be able to recognize him on the street.
I think you'd recognize him.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. I mean, it's the American president.
Never saw it.
You never saw the American president? No. Oh, we have stuff to do. All right. Well, I think with that, we're probably out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. What if Michelle Obama listened to our podcast? I
dare to dream.
I know, dare to dream.
We love you, Michelle.
We love
Great
you.
Book.
Thank you.
Everyone buy it.
Yeah. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.